Okay, so we're back in. Thanks for waiting. So we now have our panel of experts here. I've got Demetri from Zynga. Demetri, you were previously at Area Code.
Mm-hmm. All of Zynga New York was previously
you were previously Area Code. Right on. So game developers of renown. And guys, you guys did some awesome, real world games and run around the street type games, which I totally dug.
Sure, yeah.
So you've got some expertise in that area, so that's a good segue for us. Mm-hmm. Nicole Lazzaro, who has been doing user testing for years and years and years. We've worked together, oh my gosh, I blanched to think about how long ago. But an expert on the psychology of the people who actually play games and what's happening to them while they play. She's also developing games, and she's prepared some material for us today. And Michael Fergusson from, it's Ayogo, is that right? Cool. And you're making what I would call serious games. Is that a fair way to describe it? So these are games that are designed to actually have a real world impact that improves people's health, right? It's medical?
Yes.
Cool.
Medical.
Right on. Okay, well, so to kind of carry on from this morning's comments, I was talking a little bit, I touched on some of the ideas of the psychological aspects of games, but I did it more from the perspective of mythology and storytelling. It was kind of a continuation of my conversation that I had yesterday with LeVar Burton. Now I want to shift a little bit over to the psychological processes that happen inside game players' minds. And so as people are playing games, what are they thinking about? What are they doing? And what's the full toolkit available to game developers? Nicole, maybe we should start with the material that you prepared. Here, you can use this clicker and just click the right arrow.
Great.
And tell us what you've got.
All right, great. Well, as Robert TERCEK says, that I make games more fun. I run XEODesign for the past 20 years, and I come from the angle of a combination of cognitive psychology, filmmaking, and a little bit of computer programming. And I'd like to start with something that some of the research that we've done on creating engagement. I first was fascinated with games because they are self-motivating systems, as opposed to a bank website or something like that. And motivation comes from emotion. And so what we did was we actually, in 2000 to 2004, measured the emotions on players' faces, and used this technique based on Paul Ekman's facial action coding, which measures the emotions. We actually created this model. And it turns out that players want to feel, in a sense, be in situations that have 4 characteristics. So we looked at people's best-selling games, people playing home, school, and work, young and old, male and female, everything from Tetris to Halo. And it turns out that there are 4 common traits across all those games. First of all, games offer novelty. Secondly, they offer challenge. They offer friendship, and they offer meaning. That was across the board. The people's favorite moments in games that created an emotional reaction had one of those 4 traits. And so we have this, what we call the 4 keys to fun. And you can download these slides and images, if you like, on our website, 4k2f.com. And essentially, let's just go through it really quick. So on the far right, you'll see the easy fun, which is all about discovery, curiosity, wonder, and surprise. Actually, could I borrow the mic?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I have to lean in a little bit otherwise. So on the far right, we see easy fun, and these are 4 engagement loops. So what we see is when players start a game, curiosity, it's that hook. It's what pulls you into the world. You get to throw. What happens when you throw all your Sims in the pool and pull out the ladders? If you put in all of your, if you put the lion and the antelope and Zook Tycoon into the same pen, something should happen. And so that creates, these actions create the emotions that players feel, and that creates engagement. But then after a moment or two in time, you actually then encounter like a specific challenge. Well, then we slip into hard fun. So the best-selling games, people's favorite games, move you from easy fun into another type of engagement loop called hard fun, where you meet a specific obstacle, there's a goal and some strategy, and then I get really frustrated. And then if I could succeed, then I go, yes, I got the boss monster. My arms go up and they punch the sky. And then there's people fun, which is all about the emotions of friendship and bonding. So a win feels more epic if your friends are along, through competition, cooperation, the sharing of challenges, the sharing of game experiences, of easy fun experiences. You can play poker socially, or you can also play to win. Those aspects really make a lot of engagement for games. And so competition, communication, cooperation, all of those factor into friendship mechanics that create people fun. And then lastly is what we call serious fun. So a win, and I use the term fiero for that feeling of like, yes, I just won the Grand Prix. A win, that emotion is really powerful. It's one of the most powerful in games. And then it falls away fairly quickly. So where serious fun comes in is serious fun is actually how did that singular event change myself or change the world? And players find that that's a very compelling situation. So for example, they would talk about how did they get how they would play Dance Dance Revolution to lose weight. They'd play Brain Age to get smarter. All of these things go together. So I can show a couple of the different close-up slides if you like. All right, so real quick. Yeah, there we go. So let's. It's quite detailed. But let's go into easy fun. So easy fun comes with the joy of control. So it's that discovery. It's pulling you in. Like what'll happen in a game like Angry Birds or in Farmville. We have a game called Tilt World on the iPhone, which is actually the first game to use the accelerometer on the iPhone. I developed with Joe Hewitt at iPhone Dev Camp a week after the device came out. This is the more robust version of the game. And John, watch. All you have to do in this game is you have to feed flip by tilting the device. Here it's an iPad. And so here you can just tilt. So you have to go through the everything's a little bit green, but you have to catch the white things. And all you do to move the characters, you just tilt. And so players tell us that the joy, just the sheer joy of controls, really is motivating, and it captures your attention. Next, there's hard fun, and so you don't win a race just from going from point A to point B. You want some sort of challenge involved, and so here we have to have obstacles, strategy, and I'm really surprised. Like one of the next moves for social games is not just click so I can create any kind of town that I want. The strategy, having the challenges be a little bit more responsive to players' skill. And this I draw from and build on. How many people have heard of flow? The concept of flow? Csikszentmihalyi? Wonderful. Okay, great. So what we did was we actually looked at flow and looked at players playing. What we found is that some interesting things. Yes, he is definitely right that players do respond to challenge in game. So if you think of the player skill on the bottom axis, increases over time, and on the top axis, the range of difficulty increases as well. And so the best games are sort of in the middle, and here's why. Because at the beginning of a game, you want the game to be fairly accessible, but if the game doesn't get harder, you're going to leave as you move out on that x-axis. You're going to leave because you're bored, right? And then if the game gets really challenging too quickly, you're going to leave because you're frustrated. So you want to be in that range, in that nice range. And game designers are brilliant at this. There's lots of techniques to enhance that feeling of flow. Where you've got a clear goal, you've got it broken down into achievable steps, i.e. levels, and you've got these punctuated challenges. So some challenges are harder than others. And in fact, the only way that a game will make you feel that, yes, I just got the boss monster, that fiero. Fiero is an Italian word. And the only way you're going to feel that is you're going to feel if the player's so frustrated, they're about ready to throw the control through the window. or their iPhone. If they win at that moment in time, they're going to go from feeling very frustrated to like, yes, the body's on fire. And that's where you get that moment. And then you usually want to have a relaxation moment after that, and then something easy because they're feeling like really super powerful and they're making lots of progress in the game. And so you're balancing this thing over time. That's where concepts like power-ups, that's why power-ups work as well, and some other things in games. Real quick on to people fun, where we have social games, and we released this model in 2004, where I advised the game industry in 2005 that basically don't put any other feature in games now this year unless it's a video camera or an in-game camera, because players are going to create in-game movies and they're going to share them on this thing called the internet. And not only will that be great experience for players that love it, but it'll also be viral marketing for your game. I gave that talk the same month that YouTube.com was registered. So everything that's driving YouTube, everything that's driving social media comes from these emotions, just like Robert was saying earlier today, of people sharing and cooperating and competing, and those social emotions going between folks. That's what's creating a lot of this activity. And have you ever thought of what the psychologists say behind the like button in Facebook? And what does it mean that I like your status post? That I like that you had dinner or that I like that your cat died? Well, essentially, we're all primates. And basically, that like button is simply a one-button way for me to touch base. It's like, we're just going to pick a digital flea off of you.
You have fleas.
So context-free, information-free, really, or context-sensitive, but information-free, just like, yes, I'm going to do that. And then then you can have the conversation afterwards. You can extend that to a deeper thing. So I call these amici mechanics. Amici is an Italian word for friendliness. And going through that, you get more social bonding. And the only way you can get teamwork is through these emotions. So it's on Facebook. It's really not surprising to me that there aren't more people. Basically, most of the popular games on Facebook are people, plant, and pet games, because they have all of these same emotion profiles. The emotion profile of the game matches the emotion profile of the platform. And like with the iPhone, if I were to share my iPhone with you, well, what would you do? If I was showing photos, for example, well, you would stroke, you would tap, you'd pinch, you zoom. But if you were to do that same gesture on the back of my hand, we better be on a date or something. Because the gestures on the iPhone actually create social caretaking emotions. And so that's why players tell us when we do our studies is that petting my iPhone makes me happy. Isn't that brilliant of Apple to design social emotions to come out of the actions that the user has to take to use their device that contains their email, their chat, their web browsing, all of their contacts? That's a lot of the reason why that's a lot of the reason why the iPhone is so popular, and it works. Then real quickly, lastly, serious fun, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today, is that we're looking at how do a game feels less of a waste of time if it really changes themselves or it changes the world after the player finishes. So for example, in our game, Tilt World, players tell us they're not really into the points as much. They're really not into things like money, but that the players really respond to the environmental theme and this idea of combining their efforts to create sort of a global recovery. They're going to clear the world of blight, which is the negative force in the world. And so it's that coming together and that really making a difference makes it feel like a more compelling experience, because you can have emotions about those things. So that's it. Yeah.
Here, do you mind? I'm going to put this back on the main thing.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to just go back up to the eye chart. Okay. So I think that's going to be a useful thing for us to keep on the screen for a while. Demetri, why don't you tell me a little bit about how your company approaches this? Because yesterday we talked about which of these axes you guys are focused on, or which ones you're currently in, maybe where you're going in the future, if you can tell us that.
Yeah, while we don't necessarily have this framework in particular in mind, while I was looking at this chart yesterday while we were talking, I was thinking, Zynga does a lot, if not most, of its kind of development work in this kind of infinity symbol loop here between people fun and easy fun. And of course there are games like poker that you even mentioned that get into hard fun, and Mafia Wars has in quite a bit of that. And there's sort of an overlap here that isn't maybe entirely clear on the chart, but a lot of, I think a lot of social games kind of are really quite close to the top, 3/4 of this. That the people fun and the easy fun are really sort of mushed together, and that where you see the hard fun coming in is in perhaps surprising places, like thinking about your social graph and how you, in real life, are managing that. Well, am I sending, friend requests to these people? Is that, so that's actually part of the game, and designers know that. So that sort of is an interesting, almost metagame layer of kind of hard fun on top of what otherwise would seem in this structure to be really people and easy centric.
It's kind of like in Millionaire, when you want to make a call, right? You have to think carefully which question you want to make a call. When you're playing any of the Zynga games, you get to that point where it's like, gee, I'm not going to make any further progress unless I call my friends. But you don't want to do that too often, right? So this is actually cool because to me it's new and different. The games themselves aren't where the action happens. The strategy component is when do you reach out into your social graph, when you're going to spam that list, and how frequently you're going to do that. You have to really think twice about that.
Yeah, and one of the sort of surprising things about that is, I'd love to say, oh yeah, we totally always mastermind, how that works. But a lot of it is just because of the way Facebook works and of what you can get from the API. So the multi-friend selector is a multi-friend selector, and there's not much you can do about it. You can try and populate it in different ways, but you sort of, if you were designing a social game to reside in an abstract space, you probably would not do it in the exact same way that we and the entire social games industry has done it in order to accommodate what's possible on Facebook and what Facebook sort of encourages you to do.
And they'll change their APIs from time to time, and so you've got to kind of conform to that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of give and take between what's possible on the platform, what is possible in designers' heads, what are the business needs, that are also at Zynga, but at every company.
Let's talk about the psychology, not of the game designer, but of the people whose heads they're trying to get into. So when your teams are working on the new games, assuming that people, maybe there's an unmet demand for Farmville and Cityville. It's hard for me to imagine it at 100 million players, but perhaps there are a few million that haven't yet played the games. But as you guys develop your new games, obviously one of the challenges you guys face is there's a dozen competitors hard on your heels that are trying to bite your games, and so you've got to stay one step ahead. But having acquired 25 studios in about 15 months, you probably have enough game development talent under your roof to figure out the next level of game. What problems are they trying to solve? What kind of customer are they going after next? And what kinds of psychological hooks are they going to use to get that customer?
Well, so although there are playbooks for a lot of things, everywhere in the industry, we actually we do have a ton of designers at Zynga that have come from all over the place. It has become, as you suggested with the acquisitions, it's like an all-star team. I mean, these are guys that when I was growing up, and it's not just Zynga that's like this too. I mean, you look at Playdom and between Zynga and Playdom, you've got Bob Bates and Brian Reynolds and Steve Maretsky and all these guys that you sort of have idolized for years. So they've all got their entire career's worth of thoughts about how to create engagement. That being said, the former Area Code and now Zynga New York also has a bunch of ideas that we hope we can help percolate throughout the organization. And
like what? Like what kinds of things? What problems are they trying to solve?
So one of the things that I personally have been thinking about a lot lately is because of the fact that that social games typically reside in what we think of as kind of real life spaces. Whether that's farms or cities or mafias, for what it's worth. Even though you're not in a mafia in real life, you have expectations of how a mafia is organized. You have expectations of how a farm runs. Your entire training as a human being, through the media, through your education, through your experiences actually visiting farms, have sort of led you to a list of about whatever it is in your head, but maybe it's 5, maybe it's 20 things. Okay, this is what you do on a farm. And so if we're developing a game that takes place in a real world situation, I think that it behooves us to take a look at what people are going to expect and how we can interact with those expectations and how we can subvert those expectations in a surprising and delightful way, and also just how not to create cognitive dissonance. And so one of the when we were chatting about this yesterday, one of the things that I talked about was, all right, so imagine a game that's set in space, and you've got a giant planet and you've got an asteroid belt and you have a little ship that you control. So you're running back and forth from the planet to various asteroids. You're mining materials off of the planet, you're bringing it to the asteroid. Each asteroid type needs a different type of material from the planet, and it contributes a type of resource that the planet requires. There are constantly asteroids moving in from the left-hand side of the screen. You need to make sure that the ship visits every one of these new asteroids and takes the resources before they sort of expire and flow off the right. I mean, I'm describing this game and you guys are like, what? Okay.
It's pretty cosmic.
Yeah, and it's just, it sounds like a mess. If I said, this is Diner Dash. I just did a crappy reskin of Diner Dash in space. There's a kitchen, there are people that come in and eat food and require food, and there's a line of people that are gonna get angry, and if you service them the way they wanna be serviced, you get points. Your customers become happy.
This is interesting. So what you're saying, forgive me if I do this wrong, I'm going to try to recap what you just said. So a game designer has a choice to make. They come up with a game concept, the transactional core of a game, and then they come up with a metaphor, a creative metaphor to express it. If you go for something that's really out there, like the space mining game, as cool as that might be to some people, we haven't experienced that in real life, so it takes a little bit of a learning curve to get your head wrapped around that metaphor. Versus a diner, everybody's been in a restaurant, everybody has an idea of how a diner works, and so you don't have to spend time on the learning curve of how a restaurant works. You can get right into the game. And so for casual game designers, you're suggesting that's a faster path, and that's why, I guess, one of the reasons why Zynga is launching all these games that are based on very mundane, real-world things that we're familiar with, or sort of goofy, fun versions of real-world situations, but you haven't done these like super abstract science fiction space operas.
Well, just a quick add to that.
Sure.
In terms of using what you're talking about is schema theory.
Schema theory,
which is awesome. And then just to wrap around it just a little bit more, it's not just that they're just everyday and easy to understand, but hey, who wouldn't like to, flip off their boss and go buy a restaurant and do it on their own, and succeed.
Okay,
and so it creates an appealing fantasy.
Yeah.
In addition to being accessible.
Right. Well, you're right about that. Then, but I don't want to let you off the hook so quickly, Nicole, because you just dropped a bomb on us, and I need to come back to it. So, schema therapy, or
schema theory.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What the heck? Tell me what you mean by that.
So
no
this is like
here.
my latest personal game design obsession. There's a million different things in the realm of cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology that we could be talking about here, but I want to talk about this one because I like it. So schema theory is this sort of concept that was advanced by a guy named Frederick Bartlett at the beginning of the 20th century, and then sort of refined by Jean Piaget and another dude named Ulrich Nieser, and these guys are all psychologists. They're not thinking about games at all. It's a theory that sort of posits how we not only how we learn, but how you can react to an unknown situation and not be totally baffled by every new restaurant you ever walk into.
It's like recognizing a pattern.
Yeah. So there's developments tangentially off of this by guys like Marvin Minsky, who has frame theory, and he doesn't call it schemas, he calls it frames. There's some other folks who call it scripts and
But in
stories.
the game context, what you're saying is a game developer is better off focusing on a schema that we recognize easily.
Well, maybe better off. Maybe it's not so much like, hey, do this. Right. It's awesome.
But no, I get the pattern as a customer. I get the pattern, so I don't have to spend time trying to decipher what the pattern is. I can jump right into the game.
Yeah.
And then you can surprise me because you can say, well, actually, you thought that was the pattern, but here's a twist. Here's
Sure.
a unique twist.
I think that if I had an advice to give on, hey, how to use this, how to add this to your toolkit, I would say be aware of it, because it is a way, depending on whether you believe these particular psychologists and psychiatrists, this does exist. People are going to start your game, and when they see that red crate, because they have a schema, video games, red crates, explosions, they are going to shoot that thing. And if it doesn't blow up, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance that has just happened. When they look at your game and it's in space and it's got asteroids and stuff like that, they come to it with okay, well, there's no gravity, but maybe there's this weird sort of pseudo-gravity that the game Asteroids taught me about, 10 years ago. Or maybe I navigate through this the way I navigate through Space Penguin. You're going to have to deal with people's schema for the environment that you present to them, whether you want to or not.
A concrete example, we've done over 40 studies for Play First, who does the Diner Dash franchise. It's a great example in Diner Dash 1, the very first one. You have different types of customers, different levels of patience. You've got seniors, which you would, schema theory, expect to be kind of slow, and then you've got businesswomen who you would expect again to be, oh, well, they're really busy, but they'll tip well, but you got to serve them fast. And so there's this great moment in the game where you actually have to take a big group of seniors and make them wait. So that you can get the next customer, the next group of businesswomen in, seat them first, get them going, and then do the seniors. And so there's an interesting play, like you're leveraging what I know about the real world, which is what you're talking about, and then you also have to riff it off a little bit, like, oh, that was kind of not so nice on the seniors. Should I really have made them wait? And that this creates some interest in the game.
And not only that, sorry to interrupt you, Rob, but to circle back to what you were saying earlier, this is a purely abstract sort of game system derived challenge, right? That is like, okay, well, I have 8 rectangular objects in the upper right hand corner. I've got to make room for 4 rectangular objects in between them and the kitchen space. But it creates that narrative just by accessing something that your player brought to the game. Those sprites look like little senior citizens and little business women. They're not. Your player brought their own entire backstory of how senior citizens and businesswomen work in a physical space.
Oh, so it's like a projection onto the map.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's not like, hey, this is a turnkey solution, but people are going to come to your game with that. If you see a little tiny cow, they're going to think, oh, well, that's a baby cow. Maybe it needs to be near the big cows. Maybe it requires more feeding than an adult cow. Maybe I'm going to, maybe like Ian, I'm going to have to click that cow 50 times.
So this is the psychological process of completion, right? When we see an incomplete pattern, our minds are automatically drawn in to try to fill in the blank and connect the dots and so forth. So, Michael, what we've been talking about, what I've heard so far is that we're talking about presenting a pattern. This is part of the game designer's job, to present a pattern that people can recognize. And the more familiar it is, the faster they're going to recognize it. That means the faster they can actually get into the game, where you can defeat those expectations and surprise them, or you can pay off those expectations and give them a sense of empowerment and maybe more familiarity with the idea. You deal with a different kind of game, Michael. Your business is to create games that actually get people to do things in the real world. How do you use these pattern recognition techniques in your games? What parts of the familiar do you use in your games to get people engaged and to get them to get over the learning curve quickly to get started?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's we're often trying to solve very challenging psychological issues when we're trying to get people to model new behavior. Somebody is used to putting sugar in their coffee every morning, and now they have a chronic disease, they've developed diabetes, and they shouldn't do that, but it's a habit they have. We're trying to get them to break that habit, to get them out of the frame that they're used to being in and develop a new pattern. And there's all kinds of sort of underlying challenges with that. And one of them, just to talk in specifics for a second, is this idea of what we call hyperbolic discounting. The idea that you will discount future benefit to yourself disproportionate to its actual benefit to you. So you'll say, if something's closer to me in time, I'm going to value it more. A good example is if I tell you, for example, that you will get $50 today, or you could have $100 next week, you're very likely to take $50 today. If I tell you that you can have $50 next week, or $100 2 weeks from now, you're more likely to take the $100. And interestingly, there's really no kind of economic difference there. It's just a hyperbolic discount. You say, well, instant gratification is very important to me. And in that same way, we're going to use that instant gratification is what's in your mind when you're thinking about putting that sugar in your coffee. Over my life, I know I should eat less sugar, but right now I'm getting instant gratification, and probably that 1 cup doesn't make that much of a difference. So our challenge is to try to change the frame of reference for that player to make that moment and that cup of coffee important again.
How do you do that?
So we use other frames of reference that they'll be familiar with. So one of the projects we're working on right now is with an organization called Diabetes Sisters, and we're building for them a game called the Sister Quilt. And this is a group of people, everybody understands quilting. They understand that the blocks that you put into your quilt are significant. They're generally meaningful when someone's building a quilt.
So these are women of a certain age that would be familiar with quilting.
That's right. Women
So it's a
typically-
schema they would recognize immediately and go, I get a quilt, and I understand that when people make quilts, they're making these little patterns. Each person makes this little quilt piece.
That's right.
And they add up to a whole.
That's right.
So,
And
okay,
so
so you're using a familiar pattern to hook them into the game.
Yeah, that's right. So if I take a picture of my cup of coffee and I say, this coffee has no sugar in it, and I post it to my social network and tell my friends about it, then I will earn, over time, I'll earn the squares that go into my quilt. My quilt is a beautiful thing that I'm building over time, and so now I desire the quilt squares, I'm going to work to get the quilt squares, and I've made that cup of coffee significant in a different way by changing the frame of reference for it.
Okay, so you're defeating hyperbolic discounting by giving people a pattern they recognize, and they can immediately map their behavior onto that because they understand filling in each, I guess, square, one square at a time. Have I got it?
That's right,
Okay.
yeah.
And then that's one thing, the really great thing that games do, and it's easy to forget, I think, is that, if the player doesn't see it, it really didn't happen. And, in games, you usually do is you simplify the world, and then you suspend the consequences, so it doesn't really matter if I, fail on a farm or, my diner closes. But then you give feedback, you enhance the feedback, 10x what you would normally get. I think PopCap has a rule that there are no single points. You always issue points in units of 10. And that's pretty soon you're dealing in thousands and 100s and millions, and that feels good because usually most of us playing games don't have those $1 million bills in our back pocket. So.
Okay, but let me counter you a little bit. So suppose one of the people that you're trying to reprogram their behavior with a game, maybe drink fewer coffees with sugar in them. Suppose they also happen to be a Starbucks customer and they have a Starbucks card and they've bought into this pointification concept of getting as many stamps in their Starbucks card as they can to earn their way towards the next free Frappuccino. How do you counterbalance that? Because now you have two game systems in conflict. One that's motivating me to go for the next, sugary, syrupy coffee concoction, and another game that doesn't give me that immediate gratification. It gives me only the abstract notion of a fictional quilt. How do you defeat that real-world incentive?
Well, I think you talked a little bit earlier about how game designers often bristle at the idea of gamification, and some of it is just that we think that it's sort of a bastardization of the idea of it.
Say it louder. Say it right into the mic, louder.
Some of us believe it's a bastardization of the whole idea of game development. But you're pointing out, I think, a really important other problem with it is that these games are competing with each other for our attention.
Yeah.
We're constantly fighting against games that encourage us to do unhealthy things.
Yeah.
With games that encourage us to do healthy things. So, our challenge in the games that we build is to try to, as much as possible, understand the context of that particular player. Right. What's meaningful to them in their life is the quilt that I'm building with my sisters that are meaningful and important to me emotionally.
So let's grab onto
use
that
the
piece.
social right there.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
So this is where the opportunity to expand from single player, which is really what a points program is going to boil down to, single player mechanic to social dynamics of the sort that, honestly, Zynga, you guys are the masters of this stuff, right? Because you really caused me to think about my social graph in a way that nothing else on Facebook does. Because every time I spam my list on Facebook, I'm actually taking points away from my store of goodwill, right? And there's a certain, everybody's got a certain amount of goodwill there amongst their friends. But if you keep asking them for favors and asking them to give you whatever it is that you need in your game, then it's going to go down a little bit. On the other hand, if you do give an earnest appeal for help, that can be very powerful, right? And it's not just about sugar, because this is how all support programs, all the 12-step programs work as well. You create this sort of band of brothers or sisters, and they're there to help you out. So tell me a little bit about the social dynamic and how that can counter pointification programs in the real world.
Well, and I think, Demetri said something really interesting earlier about the sort of the business and technical framework that Facebook gives a game developer. One of the other interesting things it gives us is a brain chemistry environment to work in. So,
Tell me about that.
When we are participating, so there's this neurotransmitter called oxytocin, which you might be familiar with, called the cuddle drug, and Adam Pennenberg was involved in a really interesting study about it just recently.
The
that
cuddle
when a
drug.
mother, for example, is breastfeeding her baby, or you see a kitten, your brain starts to produce this drug. It helps you feel more connected to people, increases your level of trust, and so on. It's also released when we are participating in social media, when we see other people's faces, when we see other people that are meaningful to us, that we recognize as other people that are important to us in our social graph, our body also starts to release.
So this is why Facebook status updates are so addictive.
That's right.
We get a
that's
little tiny
exactly
minute
away
dose
from
of
my Twitter.
oxytocin. Really?
Potentially, though, I think that Antonio Damasio has this wonderful book called Descartes' Error, and I highly recommend for folks with a slight interest in neuropsychology. It's very accessible. But he cautions us on some of this angle of thinking, in that just by the presence of serotonin, oxytocin, a presence of a neurotransmitter or a chemical in the body, rising and falling doesn't necessarily mean, because we also have to remember in context what area of the brain is that really hitting. And so there's some more deeper research that we need to do, more than just like, hey, you feel good or you feel bad. As game designers, we're going to need to, go in and like really understand a lot more about what are the different flavors. For example, when there is no emotion, like there is no name in English for the feeling, like everyone has this situation where someone can make you roll on the floor laughing. My sister, she says the word mango. You guys can say the word mango and I don't crack a smile. Why? Well, it's a long story. You had to be there. But there's these interesting social bonding processes that we have that really do release neurochemicals, absolutely. But then when she does this, I can, when I can start breathing again, like I'm sure you can think of the person that does that in your life, well, you actually feel closer to that person. So there's there's actually an emotion that we don't really have a name for. I use Amiro, using Ami as the root, just to talk about that feeling of friendship. And then we can actually design game mechanics, not just to spam our friends, but to bring them closer.
Sure.
To create these social tokens, for example, that could go back and forth. You need a fairly open environment. And I'd love to see the next generation of Zynga games doing more of this.
Yeah, you will.
Because simply, like, we love to, award, stars and ribbons and stuff like that. But there's this wonderful study, really interesting study, 1973 by Lepper, Green, and Nietzsche. And essentially, they found that if you reward people with extrinsic, basically if you gave them extrinsic motivators like gold stars and ribbons, it actually decreased the intrinsic interest kids had in completing drawing tasks. So although they were rewarded, while they were being rewarded, they were drawing more, but after the reward stopped, they drew less. So actually the game had the opposite effect, and we have the potential as game designers to have the opposite effect.
Wait, let me see if I got that. I want to play that back because that's a really, really important point. So there's intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. And an extrinsic reward is something like a token,
Points.
a badge, points, exactly.
Yeah.
Points, money, competition even.
So you can motivate someone to do a behavior with intrinsic or extrinsic rewards. And sometimes it's expedient to use extrinsic rewards because it's faster and simpler and it applies to everybody. Everybody can get a badge if you work hard. You can work towards a badge.
You can get VC funding to create a company to do that.
But the behavior won't shift over the long term. In other words, that behavior will fade faster. Whereas if you give people internal motivation, intrinsic rewards, a sense of meaning that matters to them personally, something that changes their identity, the way they think about themselves, then they're more likely to change their habit for the long term. Have you seen this in the real world games that you're developing, Michael? I mean, have you experimented with extrinsic and intrinsic reward systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the really interesting things that we observed in the development of our game Health Seeker that we built with Diabetes Hands Foundation and Joslin Diabetes Center was that the game is a pretty simple gamification layer on top of a program of diet and exercise that was developed by Joslin, and they're having a very difficult time getting people to adopt it. We, as part of the sort of gamification layer, if you like, that we put on top of it, we added one feature in particular, which was the ability to challenge your friends. So when I take on some mission, that is, I'm going to eat kale for the first time. I've never eaten kale before. I'm going to add kale to a meal. That's my first mission. I can challenge my friends to take on that mission with me. And the challenge goes up. One of the things that we observed in the first 3 months or so that the game was running was that the average player had completed roughly half a dozen 6.2 or whatever it was missions in the game. Those that had sent at least one challenge to their friends had done double, right? Just under 12, which is not surprising. You'd expect people who are sending challenges to be more aggressive players of the game. But those players that had received a challenge from a friend but never acknowledged it, that is, they never responded to the challenge directly, never acknowledged they even received it, those people had done on average nearly 3 times as many, 17.2 or whatever, I can't remember the exact number, 17 point something, healthy missions in the game.
Wait, the people who got a challenge but never responded to it had the highest response in terms of changing their behavior?
Well, there was a slightly higher response among those people who had responded, but it was within sort of the margin of error.
So you're saying that just receiving the invitation was enough to motivate
That's
change
right.
my behavior?
Knowing that somebody else cares enough about my health to ask me to participate in the mission.
Got it.
Yeah, and
makes
that's
sense.
I mean that's the kind of thing that Gareth was talking about yesterday in the in the Facebook talk. Just the fact that your friends, whether or not you ever tag a picture, just the fact that your friends are tagging you in a picture, or your friends are tagging someone you know in a picture, even that tangential touch of the social graph is enough to activate. To reactivate a user or to activate a user for the first time, and it's astounding.
It's like a gravitational force field. It draws you back in, right?
Yeah.
It's totally true. Your Facebook notifications are the most powerful magnet ever known. People crave validation more than sex, and they crave validation more than money. Validation is the most important thing to most people, certainly when it comes to social media. And validation is anything from, someone looked at your profile to someone liked something. This is such a powerful hook, I find.
I'd like to tell you, Robert, that I think you're exactly right.
Cool. Thanks. I got validation. Makes me feel great.
I want to just kick it up a notch here. It's like, yes, definitely. I think that's very powerful. But at some point, what happens is that we also habituate. We also get to a point where, like, just looking at some photos of they took photos of me. So at some point, you're gonna hit this plateau. And as game designers, we're almost there. Within this next year, it's not going to be enough just to have a friend say, "Hey, you know what? Come feed my chickens," or whatever it happens to be, or look at my photographs. We're going to have to do a lot more because the research that we've done in People Fun, the social interaction, there are more emotions in that quadrant than the other three combined. And if people playing the same game in the same room have more emotions than people playing the same game in different rooms. And so what we've got now with Facebook games is we've just really got this one-dimensional, kind of like Flatland, one-dimensional kind of social interaction going on where I'm just, again, flea picking back and forth, where maybe we're exchanging cows instead of fleas, but that we don't nearly have the social space explored.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right, and I think when people have taken a look at all these acquisitions and said, well, why do God, you guys are picking up game designers like a Hoover. Yes, because we know that.
Yeah, but you're picking up folks that are doing single player games.
I thought it was just buying revenue and the ramp up to the IPO. Hey, folks, we want to get questions from the floor, so if anyone out there would like to ask a question, I think there's mics available down here in the front, and sometimes we have a runner who can help us get the mics moving around. If there are people who like to ask a question, please do step forward. Thank you, Mr. Mike Runner. Anyone out there?
There's always that awkward moment where people, should I ask? Go ahead and ask, come on.
Does anyone want to hear 3 tips on how to make things intrinsically
What's your name,
motivated?
sir?
My name is Alan.
Hi.
And I'd like to know if you know anything about mirror neurons and what they might have to do with gameplay.
Super. Mirror neurons is the question. Who wants to grab it?
I can start a little bit on. So mirror neurons are the part of the brain that fires when we see somebody else's behavior that we want to pattern. So the idea is roughly that I have much of the same experience doing something myself as I have watching somebody else do it. And that's how behavior passes between people. This is what babies are doing when they're looking at our faces when we're speaking, how to pick up language, how we adopting new skills, why we get a lot of satisfaction watching somebody else dance, almost as much satisfaction as dancing ourselves. And this is part of the sort of the social patterning effect. Christakis and Fowler did this interesting study about the spread of behavior through social networks, and a lot of it the speculation is a lot of this has to do with how mirror neurons work in our brain, that we see somebody else's behavior and we instinctively feel in part that that's our behavior. And so it becomes part of our personality.
And I think there's some really interesting stuff, really early research still, but there's been quite a lot of neurological studies using fMRI and other brain scanning techniques in that different areas of your brain light up. But it isn't just social, I want to point out. It actually is, you can touch a map and touch your leg and touch somebody else's leg and show people images of this. And you'll see that there's these areas that are similarly activated. What's interesting to me is that it seems like there's a lot of exploration about, is that the root of empathy? And the opportunity for game designers is that it doesn't have to be just empathetic. We don't have to just empathize and feel Fiyero from Indiana Jones, getting triumph and winning the victory. It's actually you can do it yourself. A movie creates empathy, relying mostly on mirror neurons to create that experience of a movie will never hand you a jet ski and let you save the world from nuclear doom, but a game has to. So the cool thing about mirror neurons is that you're going to get empathetic responses from what you see on the screen, absolutely, but then you're also going to get the proactive ones. And it turns out, in people fun, is that there are a lot of emotions that require two people. So we think about mirror neurons, the ability for us to, move, have emotions related to someone else's emotional state. But then we also have this ability to experience gratitude, generosity, Schadenfreude, Nachas. There's all these great emotions that you can experience directly, and you don't have to see two people, Romeo and Juliet on the stage. You can actually be them.
One thing also that this kind of, just brainstorming this while you were asking it and while we were talking about it is with a social network and dozens of other people playing the same game that you're playing, why do we have a tutorial that's presented by an NPC when it could be much more powerful to offer you a tutorial that's essentially presented by your friend's actions? Give it a shot. It might work. Who knows?
Question about intrinsic and extrinsic value. You mentioned that extrinsic value sometimes falls short and has a negative effect. So I'd like to know what would you suggest as a game designer? What could we do to provide intrinsic value to players? And then the other question also is there a difference between how adults perceive intrinsic value and how kids perceive intrinsic value? Because we make games for kids primarily, and we'd like to, sort of dive deep into that concept.
For serious fun, for serious games, first of all, serious games, I have an opinion that basically serious games have to be fun first. So in our game, Tilt World, not only do you earn points in the game and make progress in the game, but the player's group progress is going to actually impact the world in real ways. To make things motivating, there's really intrinsically motivating. There's sort of three tips that work pretty well. The first one is you want to be sure that you've got that your progress in the game, so not just external points, but it's based on internal factors that they can control. So really bake it in. We have something called a game plan on our site at 4K2F.com that would allow you to bake that in. But you want to be sure that the main game mechanic are factors that they can control that relate to their values, their motivations, and their actions. You want belief that their agency, the belief in that their agency in making that change. You really want to make sure that your feedback systems are enhancing that. So if you do any sparkles on screen or rainbows like Peggle, I love Peggle's feedback, but you want to make sure that it's coming from those things that map to their core values. And then you want to be sure that it's an interest in, that the result is an interest in the topic itself. So the difference between adults and kids, it's not just adults and kids, it's like, well, what kind of thing are they really interested in? Make sure your concept is strong, and then make sure that the progress in your game is mapped right on that. So for example, social mechanics in Diner Dash are brilliant. Nick Fortuna is the designer, and you're getting, by clicking on these could be just little red boxes that go from red to green, but instead you're actually clicking on the emotional state. You're actually adjusting the emotional state of your NPC, your non-player characters, by serving them fast or slow. And so you're tapping into players' social, emotional response to those emotional states of other people to make progress in the game. And so that really creates it much more intrinsic than just saying, hey, you clicked the block before it got red. Hey, you mined that asteroid.
It's important to recognize that what we're talking about, the idea of, well, okay, how do you create intrinsic motivation as opposed to just sort of badgifying stuff or pointifying stuff. That is the hard challenge of game design right now, and specifically, I think, to avoid doing the strip mining that you're talking about, Robert. Like that's our jobs, and those three things are definitely helpful. There's a dozen other things. There's a million books that I could recommend, but like that's where the rubber really meets the road in game design.
Skinner boxes are not fun. Skinner boxes are not fun. They can compel. You can get the desired behavior. You can A/B test it and really get a great Skinner box, but you're not going to get an emergent gameplay experience and aspirational fantasy that people will want to share with their friends. And the other dark secret is that with any kind of extrinsic reward is you've got habituation. So in WoW that's why in WoW you start with copper coins, and then you go to silver coins, and then gold coins. You have to constantly up your dose in order to have that same effect. So that's why using intrinsic, tapping into players' intrinsic values, their intrinsic motivations, making sure it's part of the game mechanic is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, just to talk about our quilt again for a second, just a little bit of shorthand. When a player is looking at their quilt, we could have just given them a square, and it could just be like a gold badge that sits on their profile. But we always make sure that they can, through that quilt square, they could always get back to a description of the thing that they did to earn that square.
Mm-hmm. But what could make that more what could make that more intrinsic? Because it still seems like external, like a quilt that we're building.
Well, the quilt is a social object. That's part of. It represents the advancement of the whole community together towards a more healthy life. And the challenge is coupling the object with the underlying behavior, so that they always feel that this quilt is truly representative of the things that they have done. It's not some separate object.
Because the fun thing, like in games like Diner Dash, when you win level 4, the trophy, this is very intrinsic, the trophy for level 4 is a coffee maker. And that totally, borks your strategy for level 5. It's a power-up, but then it also you had to completely, hard fun-wise, you had to completely rework how you play the game. And then as your diner gets, because then you've got a new station. So you have a coffee maker that you can use when customers get too frustrated. Adds complexity. And then you get it, it's a trophy, but it's not a trophy room, which is an abstraction, extrinsic. It's actually the back wall, again, brilliant design. The back wall of that diner just becomes it goes from a greasy spoon, say, to a 5-star restaurant, piece by piece. You've got decorations, but you also have these functional upgrades.
Let me ask you a question about that. So
It affects the gameplay.
Umar Haik is an economist who writes for the Harvard Business Review, and I think one of the most fun bloggers to read out there. And he wrote a really good piece about gamification called Unlocking the Mayor Badge from Meaninglessness. And the reason he wrote this piece is that he said, this kind of trend, this marketing trend towards gamification, there are lots of critics, and he points to some of them. But in his view, he always looks at things from the perspective of markets. And one of the things that defines a market is that an actor in the market makes real decisions, meaningful decisions. So, I can talk enthusiastically about meaning in mythology and personal meaning and so forth. He talks about it like an economist. A meaningful decision is one where you're going to gain something by making the decision.
Yeah.
And his criticism of a lot of the pointification programs is that you're not really being forced to make meaningful choices.
It's got to change you or change the world.
Of a game, according to.
That's exactly right. Or it's a meaningful game, right? A bad game is one where it doesn't really make any difference what you do. Forgive me, but Farmville, it doesn't really matter where I plant this crop or what crop I plant. I'm sure there is an element of strategy, but it feels meaningless to me personally.
Yeah.
It's mostly about doing 6,000 clicks so I can get to the next level. And so where I plant it, how I...
There's a pretty steep cliff between the average player and someone who actually does have a pretty firm. Oh yeah, totally.
Okay, fine.
And Frontier actually shows that perhaps a little more easily when you see on your friends' frontiers, this weird checkerboard pattern of geese. Well, the geese are the cheapest way to stop the weeds from encroaching on your on your property, and placing them in this weird spaced out checkerboard pattern is the most efficient method of making sure that you don't have to come back every few hours to kill another set of weeds.
And you're having to make a trade-off there. So part of it is spending a little bit of money to get the geese, and the most efficient way to do that, and then it frees you so you don't have to spend time weeding. Now you can go do some other activities. So so it is a little bit of a time management kind of a puzzle to solve.
But it's a slow-mo time management.
Do your clients have to do that too? I mean, the games that you're making for real world, kind of like let's change the world, let's change behavior kind of games. Do you give people difficult choices to make as well? Are there meaningful decisions in your games?
Well, sure.
Can you lose something in one of your games?
Well, in a lot of our games, because we're dealing with chronic diseases, losing is a pretty terrible thing.
Okay, it's terminal.
Right? We're talking about, we don't have to worry about importing meaning. We're not trying to gamify apathy. We're not trying to monetize apathy in our games, right? People really, really deeply care. We have the benefit when we start of working in an area where people already come really caring about what they're doing. The
Okay.
problem
Is that
is
then?
attaching
Is there a danger of overdoing it then? And that's it, where the stakes are really high, where you overdo the meaning. You know, like, wow, this is a really difficult choice. It's life and death, literally.
So that is exactly true. So that's why in our games we're very, very careful never to provide you with some kind of like say for example, you showed earlier the forward focus with a plant that dies or is more healthy depending on what you do. We would never have something like that in our game.
Right.
It's very dangerous to show somebody
Dying.
something getting unhealthy.
It's literally game
But,
over.
but wait, I think I'd argue with that. I mean, just not to sound crass, but in terms of a game, I mean, if I were to do a simulation, healthcare or anything, but like let's say a nuclear power plant, if I were to give you a nuclear power plant game, what's the first thing you're going to try and do?
Depends on your player type.
No, it doesn't. Like, who would blow it up? Go for a nuclear meltdown, okay?
But that's not every single person. I mean,
and then who would not? Who would not go for nuclear meltdown? Okay.
it's not bad. Because I never do. And I always take, I have never once intentionally caused Godzilla to destroy my SimCity.
Oh, you never used Godzilla or
Never
anything
once.
like that?
I never
Okay.
do it.
Okay.
Listen, we are out of
This
time.
is the transgressive thing. Engage.
This conversation's been an immense pleasure for me. So, Demetri,
Thanks.
Michael, Nicole, thank you for your time. Thanks to your great audience. Stick around because we have two experts in the process of games in the real world coming up next here in their Games Everywhere session this morning. Thank you.